Here is a fascinating question for discussion. Does Seventh-day Adventist theology predict another civil war or something worse for the United States of America? Dr. Judd Lake is professor in the School of Religion at Southern Adventist University, and in the year 2017 he published this book here titled A Nation in God's Hands, that argues that from an Adventist perspective, the Civil War was a divine judgment upon the nation for the evil of slavery. Of course, there has been already a massive amount of material published on the Civil War, but this research is unique in that it gives a theological interpretation through the prophetic lens of Ellen White, who Adventists believe had a special gift of prophecy. To appreciate the timeline, the Civil War is dated from April 1861 to April of 1865, and Ellen White had received several visions concerning the war from January 1861 to about the end of 1862, wherein she made several interesting statements, quote, "God is punishing this nation for the high crime of slavery and would punish the South for the sin of slavery and the North for so long suffering its overreaching and overbearing influence." Again, I saw that both the South and the North were being punished. God's scourge is now upon the North because they had so long submitted to the advances of the slave power. Now, the reason why this is so interesting and why it may be relevant to us today is because when you compare abortion to slavery, then abortion is clearly, both quantitatively and qualitatively, far, far worse, which of course begs the question, if it is true that God punished the USA for the sin of slavery, then why would he not punish the nation for the evil of abortion? Again, if it is true, as Ellen White says, that to some degree this is a nation in God's hands, and that the USA needed to suffer divine judgment for slavery, then why would he not do this again for abortion? That's a good question. Why? Now, to be clear, nowhere does Judd Lake talk about abortion. His book is only about this fascinating history and Ellen White's interpretation. However, if this framework is true, then the question remains. A few interesting observations. First, Ellen White was not the only American who felt this way. Judd Lake documents other abolitionists who felt that the Civil War was caused by slavery and that the war was a judgment. What makes her comments unique is that she received this in vision. Second, her first vision was in January, and although she said people in the North were, quote, making sport of the secession of South Carolina, she had just been shown that a large number of states are going to join that state and there will be a most terrible war. So although there were folks in the North who took these events seriously, a lot of people thought it was not a big deal and that not much was going to happen. Ellen White was like, no, it's going to get really bad. Dr. Lake cites historians who document that Americans were oblivious to the amount of bloodshed and horror that would occur in the next few years. So at that time, back then, a lot of people didn't think that there was going to be anything too serious. But it's interesting to observe that even today, in our country right now, it's so polarized and divided that for years now, we've already been seeing a lot of chatter and headlines with language of a possible civil war. According to the framework laid out in this book, the only way to escape judgment was for the nation to ban slavery and grant emancipation to the slaves. In the beginning of the war, even Abraham Lincoln did not want to ban this, but as the war progressed, he began to realize that this was the real issue, and that the only way to end the division of the country was to bring an end to slavery, which interestingly happens to align with these statements from Ellen White. Now, remember, this is just creative speculation, but if we engage in speculation and apply this same framework to today, then it's possible that there will be another terrible war or horrible judgment of some sort, and that the only way to reverse course is for a federal ban on abortion. Interestingly, if you follow the news on abortion, you will know that After Roe was overturned in 2022, each state has since decided either for or against, and now even Republicans and President Trump have adopted the position to just tolerate this situation as is, and that there will be no efforts to federally protect the unborn. So, very similar to the early days of Lincoln. Third, another interesting parallel is that arguments for slavery are the exact same arguments for abortion. We detailed that in a previous video. Also, while the 19th century USA was terribly divided on slavery, it was not divided on abortion. While the nation was engulfed in division and war, all the states, both in the North and the South, all unanimously passed anti-abortion legislation. The 2022 Supreme Court Dobbs decision that overturned Roe stated the following, quote, "In this country during the 19th century, the vast majority of the states enacted statutes criminalizing abortion at all stages of pregnancy," closed quote. So we were divided on slavery, but united on abortion. And now it's the complete opposite. We are united on slavery and divided on abortion. Now, right here is where it gets really bad, because in the 19th century, Adventist pioneers openly condemned abortion as child murder and infanticide, and they praised anti-abortion legislation. But today, it's the complete opposite. In 1857, when the American Medical Association began its famous efforts to outlaw abortion, led by Dr. Horatio Storer, our very own Adventist pioneers openly praised these efforts, stating that, quote, "The medical profession have taken a noble stand, and society owes a debt of gratitude to Dr. Horatio Storer of Boston." Our Adventist pioneers were surrounded by a national effort to make abortion illegal in every state of the Union, and they openly praised this work as necessary for society's good. But as has been documented in our own official journals, the Adventist leadership, through fraud and deception in the early 1970s, accepted a pro-abortion position that has continued now for over 50 years. We have killed tens of thousands of children in our own hospitals, especially during the 1970s to 1990s. No apology, no repentance whatsoever. Our church leaders have argued to the Supreme Court that abortion should be legal, and our institutions openly honor and celebrate the most notorious abortionist in all of history, who boasted of killing over 250,000 children. This man is celebrated as the example forever for our youth. So, needless to say, we have a problem with this. Even though we are publicly condemned as hypocrites by Christianity Today, Washington Post, and other international media, we Adventists are completely unrepentant and totally shameless. No shame whatsoever. In the 19th century, our Adventist church was completely correct and right, and now we are completely wrong. And if this framework by Ellen White is true, then we are woefully guilty of, among other things, doing all that we can to lead our nation into damnation and judgment. How completely wild that the very denomination that would profess the gift of prophecy, that enlightened people's minds to understand that such evils like slavery were provoking God's wrath, is the exact same denomination today doing all that it can to defiantly lead out in provoking the wrath of God. This, of course, begs another question. If this framework still applies today, and if this biblical principle is true that to whom much is given, much is required, then it would follow that the Adventist Church can expect a horrific judgment, because if God judges a nation in this manner, then how much more will he judge his own people who have misrepresented his character to the very nation being judged? Remember that unlike the abortion industry, we Adventists for over 50 years have made it a point to tell the world that killing little children in their mother's womb is part of the healing ministry of Jesus. And just like the slave owners of old, we have invoked the very name of God as reason why killing children should remain legal. Consider the statement by Ellen White that God's anger burns against this nation, and especially against the religious bodies who have sanctioned and have themselves engaged in this terrible merchandise. And another question is about the Jews. It is a fact that the World Jewish Congress openly, publicly boasts that Jews are disproportionately responsible for the legalization of killing children in the USA, and they are proud of doing this. So the question is, will God hold the Jews responsible, and what would that look like? Dr. Bernard Nathanson, a former Jew who later converted to Catholicism, one of the most well-known leaders in the pro-abortion legalization reform movement, wrote books detailing how this history is entirely one of deception. Another question is that in the 19th century, the lines were simple. It was the North and the South, but now it's much more different with pro-life and pro-choice states. Many cities are pro-choice while surrounding rural areas are pro-life. This map is not so neat and clean like the 19th century. And again, to a great degree, the promotion of this evil is almost entirely due not to the general public, but to powerful organizations in the media, academia, Hollywood, and government. So, question, will God judge everyone as equally responsible, or will the judgments be proportionate? This is just creative thinking out loud based upon this framework from the 19th century. Speaking of slavery, Ellen White specifically says, quote, "It is this and this alone which lies at the foundation of the war," close quote. We need to discuss whether this framework is still true, because if it is, then something very bad is going to happen to the nation and to our church. And we need to remember that we have been warned. We're not ignorant. We Adventists, whenever something bad happens or whenever we are criticized, we really have a habit of wanting to paint ourselves as the victims or martyrs. But in this case, on this point, we are completely guilty and we have blood on our hands. We are a bloody church and we own this. We have been warned repeatedly for decades, but we just don't care. In the book, Dr. Lake documents how during the war there was a big shift in sentiment and that soldiers and leaders began to realize that it was slavery. Slavery was the core problem. Abolitionists, however, had always believed this. Lake cites, for example, Frederick Douglass, who wrote, quote, "The war now being waged in this land is a war for and against slavery, and that it can never be effectually put down till one or the other of these vital forces is completely destroyed." So in a similar manner, I wrote in the margin of my book that pro-choice Adventism must be completely destroyed and annihilated. There is no way, there's just no possible way that we as a church can go forward officially and publicly supporting and preaching from our pulpits that Jesus wants child murder to be legal. That's insane. That's going to have to be completely put down. But unfortunately, considering the level of arrogance and pride, looks like it's going to take something horrible to make that happen. So, if we just stop and think this through, at some point between now and the finishing of the Great Commission, the Adventist Church is going to have to, at some point or another, repent of this evil and start telling the truth. That's inevitable. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. Dr. Lake also cites an article from the Review and Herald in 1861 that asks, "Does the blood of 4 million slaves still cry to God for vengeance?" But with abortion, we are well over 60 million now, and that's only within the USA. This raises another question because this problem is not confined only to one nation. This is now an international problem with an estimated 73 million children killed every year globally. However, if we view this through the lens of responsibility, then we Adventists are the most responsible of all the people on the planet, because it's we who make the highest claim to possessing a knowledge of the Bible and present truth, which we reject through our support for abortion. You can have the Bible or you can have abortion, but you can't do both. And we're clinging to abortion and in doing so rejecting the truth. Anyways, of course, there's a lot more that can be said, but that's enough for today. I do recommend getting the physical book. There's a Kindle version, but I like the physical one because you can write lots of notes and do a lot of highlighting and interact with the book. It's very interesting to read, especially about the stories of how angels came down from heaven and interfered in the battles between the North and South and caused the northern troops to retreat. Very interesting stories. Anyways, thanks for watching, and as always, have a great day.